And I would like to welcome you to this talk, Contract First APIs. My name is Darrel Miller. I am a developer on the Azure API Management Service. A little caveat about what I'm presenting here. This is a way of designing HTTP APIs, or a process of managing HTTP APIs. It is not the holy grail. It is not the only solution. I'm simply trying to present to you another tool in the toolbox. And it is starting to become a more popular way of doing API design work for reasons that will hopefully become more apparent as I go through this talk. I use the term contract. I'll switch. Sometimes I'll say contract. Sometimes I'll talk about API description languages. They're kind of interchangeable. We use API description languages in order to define a contract for our API. Quick show of hands. Who's heard of Swagger? Who's heard of OpenAPI? Oh, that's not bad, not bad. We'll get into a little bit of the history of that. You may have already heard it, but I love telling the story over and over again. Most people, when they have worked with Swagger or OpenAPI, they have come at it from an approach which we call the code-first approach. So this is where people already have APIs, and they've learned that, hey, there's this cool set of tooling that will help me generate reference documentation. It will help me generate clients in multiple different language platforms and languages. So they find tooling that will auto-generate that API description for them. The advantage is they don't have to go out and learn how to write that format manually. They already have the API. All they have to do is add some annotations to their source code, and it spits it out. There's a few challenges to this approach because there's some mismatches. Like there's things that you can do in Web API, like ASP.NET Web API, that can't be described in, for example, in OpenAPI. So there's a few challenges, but it certainly avoids learning a whole new format and learning the syntax and structure for it, especially because, first of all, you have to pick your format, right? We have quite a long and rich history of attempting to do description formats. WSDL, back in the 2000s, was Web Services Description Language. It was a way of defining a contract for a SOAP-based API. And then in like the late 2000s, there was Waddle came along, the Sun Microsystems, when REST started to become popular. It was another XML-based format, but for describing HTTP resources, and left all that kind of SOAP stuff behind. Didn't really get much popularity because by that point, people were sort of tired of angle brackets and namespaces, but some people used it, and some people still use it today. 2011 was kind of the first introduction of Swagger, which was now a JSON-based format, and we all know how curly braces are so much better than angle brackets, right? So it was a lot more popular. It used JSON schema as a way of describing payloads, and there became sort of an explosion of people trying to do this description language. API came out with API Blueprint. MuleSoft produced RAML, which was a YAML-based. API Blueprint was a Markdown-based format. And we went through kind of some years of kind of description wars. People were building different tools that work with different things. And it was like the first thing you had to do if you wanted to use a description language was pick which one, right? And there were pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages. And it kind of sucked. Although there was a lot of innovation in the types of tools that were built. So in 2015, the Swagger tooling spec, all that IP was acquired by a company called SmartBear. And they actually did a clever thing. They said, okay, if we want this format to be popular, we have all this tooling, but we're not going to get industry buy-in if we own that spec. So they donated the specification to the Linux Foundation, and sorry, I'm just turning on focus hours here. They changed it. It used to be called quiet hours. That was easy. Now it's called focus hours. I'm all confused. So they donated the specification to the Linux Foundation and basically said, okay, industry, you can go and figure out what the next thing to do with this is, and we'll continue with the tooling. So there's still the Swagger name still lives on with Swagger UI, Swagger Editor, Swagger CodeGen, but the spec from this point on is now called OpenAPI because we needed a more boring and enterprisey name for the specification. And we started off, we had about 7 member companies who were part of the OpenAPI initiative, the people who sponsored the party last night, yay. And we're now up to 33 members and these are companies, large companies, small companies, who are all helping to promote and educate people and try and spread the word about the value that you can bring with OpenAPI. It's important to be aware that as far as the technical direction of the specification, that is kept independent to the member companies. Anybody can get involved in the direction of the OpenAPI specification. You can do pull requests. We have weekly meetings where anybody can come and attend, and we encourage people to get involved and try and help us build. I mean, we've produced 3.0 specification. We're working now on a 3.1 specification. The nice thing about this kind of momentum around the single spec is if you look at this tiny little logo down there, that's API Area, the people who did Blueprint, and the guy next to it is MuleSoft, the people who did RAML. They are also now part of the OpenAPI initiative, and they're putting the backing behind it. We are now working with some of the RAML folks to bring some of the cool features that were in RAML, like overlays, into the OpenAPI spec. So the point of this whole segue is that we're now at a point where kind of the entire industry is behind a single description language, which makes it more reasonable and more viable to just say, okay, let's start with writing the spec first, the contract first, and we'll generate implementation artifacts afterwards. Now, I say contract first, but that's a little bit of a lie, right? You're not starting by, okay, let's open the text editor and start writing the contract in OpenAPI. You still are going through the requirements, defining the use cases, the scenarios for your API before actually starting to create like a contract type artifact. And I use the word contract too, and contract has a lot of negative connotations insofar as it's something that is binding and tight and restrictive and constrains us. But one of the reasons why the Swagger OpenAPI has been a lot more successful than I would argue maybe back in the WSDL and XML days, we ran into a bunch of challenges with, I used to say when you would build a recompile a SOAP service, if you sneezed while it was compiling, there was a chance you could break the client. Because it was very, very rigid and fragile. And that came from the nature of the way the spec was defined, the contract, especially XSD was very limiting in the way it said, if I haven't told you about a particular property, then if that property is included in the payload, then it doesn't match the spec. It was very constraining in that it told you exactly what could and could not happen in the interaction. Whereas OpenAPI and JSON schema, they take a slightly different approach. It's sometimes called an open world system versus a closed world system. In JSON schema and OpenAPI, it's an open world system where we describe what is possible, but we don't tell you what everything that is potentially possible. So to take that as a very concrete example, I have a little snippet of OpenAPI, and I define a resource that's sitting at the root, and I say, if you get a 200 response, you're going to return application/JSON, and it's going to be some kind of object there. I'm not telling you exactly what the object looks like, but that's what it's going to be. And you may also get a 404, which obviously indicates that the resource isn't found. Now, those two status codes I've told you about. Now, I'm not telling you that you aren't going to get other status codes, because I'm pretty sure very few people have ever been able to write an entire API product and never make a syntax error that could potentially produce a 501 response. A server that's never going to return a 503 server unavailable. These things happen on the web. And you also have the possibility in the HP world that there could be an intermediary that sits between the client and the server. You don't have control over that. It could return status codes that aren't in your API description. So when you're consuming these contracts, you can't assume that just because something is not included there, that it will not happen. If it's there, then yes, that is something that's supported, but it is not exhaustive about what might happen. And this is critical when you're building the system. And the same goes for JSON schema. By default, when you describe an object and the properties that are in an object, the alternative properties, the default value, is, additional properties, the default value is true. There could be other properties. If you don't know them, you don't recognize them, you ignore them. So this is a fundamental difference of the way we're building contracts today, and it's why it works so much better on the web, because the web, you don't control both ends of the wire so many times. Things change. We're working in different languages. People upgrade platforms. You have to be a lot more flexible, and that's why people often will try and compare, oh, yeah, OpenAPI is just SOAP and WSDL just in JSON, but it's not. It takes a fundamentally different approach. So let's actually build an API. Let's build a conference API. Because it's a domain that we all know, we understand about speakers and sessions and stuff like that. And whenever I'm starting building an API, surprisingly enough, I do often kind of design APIs using PowerPoint, just because I happen to know how to drag and drop boxes and stuff. And it involves me getting too stuck in implementation details. And I always like to start with a home document, right? I sort of did quite a bit of hypermedia stuff, and you would always have an entry point in a home. And today, when you're working in this kind of contract world, why not just stick the contract at the home? If somebody wants to hit that home document and retrieve that description of your entire API and process it at runtime, why not let them? So we'll start with the home. But what do we want to be able to do if we have a conference API? We want to maybe build a mobile app. We want to be able to build websites or something. But we want to know what this conference is about. So let's create a resource called topics, which is the list of topics that are going to be presented at this conference. I have a list of topics. What else do we need? Well, we need a list of speakers. We want to know, maybe I want to choose whether I want to attend the conference based on who is actually speaking there. And, well, when is this? Oh, it's going to happen on a certain set of days. These are the days that the conference will occur on. Maybe I can't make it all of those days. Well, what sessions exist on those particular days? Because maybe I can only show up for one of the days of the conference. Well, so we've got collections of things, and whenever we have collections of things, chances are we're going to want to be able to drill down into a little bit more detail. So we'll create resources so I can go and look at the details of a particular topic. That's probably going to be a bit boring because it's probably just a simple string. Sessions are obviously going to have abstracts of talks and speaker bios, right? These are the kinds of things that we might want to drill down into. So these are some of the resources. Now there's relationships that would be interesting to traverse too. For example, I have a topic, but tell me what sessions are on that particular topic, or what sessions a particular speaker is covering. Or maybe more complicated, something like what speakers are speaking on a particular topic. These are all kinds of things. And then maybe there's some other resources, reviews. I want to do a read-write API where I want to take reviews from audience members to see what they think about the particular session. And you can start to, add more complex scenarios, sessions, search for sessions by a particular keyword, or search for speakers by name. You can sort of see how you can slowly start to build up this visualization of what your API is going to look like. And it's something you can sit down with an analyst or a customer and say, okay, does this cover the basic scenarios that I'm interested in? No URIs have been harmed in the creation of this design. We haven't sat down figuring out what exactly our URI structure looks like, because it really doesn't matter. So that's sort of where we're going to start with our API. And now it kind of maps fairly easily into creating a contract for the same thing. So let's do that. Let's write a contract. Now I have to do a little switch over here. Okay. Write some text and see whether it's big enough for the folks in the back. No, that looks rather small. There we go. And I'm going to do that. Like, you can do OpenAPI in JSON or in YAML. I'm going to use YAML because I will get lost in curly braces if I do it in JSON. So YAML it is. We're case sensitive, but I've set my tab to 2 tabs automatically. It's 2 spaces, so we should be good. Yeah, in Swagger version 2, it used to say Swagger at the top. Now it says OpenAPI 3.0. Actually, technically, should write that. We do semantic versioning on the API now, so when we find mistakes in the spec and we update it, we introduce a new version. There's actually a 3.02 that should be coming out in a couple of weeks, but it's a non-functional change, just fixing the spec. Minimum thing for an OpenAPI spec, you need an info object, you need to give it a title. And you need a version, which is required, but guess what? We don't say required actually needs to contain anything, and considering I'm going to get this API right the first time, I don't even need to version it. So that is an absolutely minimal OpenAPI document, and one of the nice things of tools being available, like built into VS Code here, there's a little preview Swagger, and it actually, because it's using the Swagger editor and they now support V3, it will actually render out. There's absolutely nothing defined in here, but let's get a pretty view. Or you can head over to editor.swagger.io or the many other tools, redoc. There's lots of other tools that support the specification, and the list of things that are supporting V3 is growing. Okay, so what are we going to build? We're going to create, of course, we need that home document. We need topics, a list of topics. And we need, what else do we need? We need, oh, I'll put a slash at the beginning of there, because you have to, sadly. Topics. I forgot to say at the beginning. Like, please, feel free to yell out and ask questions as we go through, and I'm quite happy to go off script. And we're going to do that. That should keep us busy for the next few minutes, and it should give you an overall idea of how this process goes. It'll take me longer to go through all of the resources in that PowerPoint slide. Okay. Now that's actually not valid because there are required things. So if I were to paste this into Swagger Editor, and it's going to give me a bunch of errors because I am missing various pieces of information. I can't say I'm a big fan of the way that it does the error reporting here. But there's other tools that are starting to do that a little bit better. Built into VS Code is a tool that Microsoft used for a lot of their APIs called AutoRest, and it will do syntax highlighting and validation as you're doing the editing. We don't quite yet support V3, so I don't have it enabled at the moment. Okay, so what operations are we going to support? Well, on this route, we're going to return back this actual document itself. So it's only going to be a get. In the topics, we're going to do a get and a post. And we're going to do a get over here. And we're going to do a get over there, okay? And I kind of like doing this kind of top-down approach. Slowly expanding it, it's a personal preference. Do it however you like. So, minimum thing that we need to define when it comes down to a path is spell responses correctly. And we need to put an response code here. And it has to be a string. I'll show you why in a minute, sadly. Description, which also is a mandatory value. I could leave this quotes, but I'm not going to. I'm actually just going to write standard. Okay, good. And, well, I said that this is going to return an OpenAPI description, so how don't we'll actually say that. So there's going to be some content that comes back, and the media type of that is going to be application/vnd.oas.openapi. We're supposed to have registered this. We will soon. That's what it's hopefully going to look like, the media type for description. Okay, that's dead simple, no problem. Let's move on, let's do topics. Responses, 200. Description. This one here is a list of things. So we're going to use a slightly different media type. We're going to use application/VND collection plus JSON, which is a really handy media type for returning lists of things. And it has the ability to have like a template if you want to add new items in the list. It doesn't really care what data items are actually in the list, but quite a useful, and there's open source tools out there for parsing that. That's great if you want to bind to some kind of UI control that shows a list of things. The UI doesn't really care what it is that's actually showing the list. Really all we care about is being able to select an item and then do something with that item. So that's a list of topics. Now, we want to be able to add a new topic, hopefully. So we have a post method. So we're going to do the responses the same way, because everything's the same. If you're familiar with 2.0, you'll notice that the whole produces and consumes thing has gone away. We don't use produces and consumes to declare what media types are supported. We use this content object. And I made a mistake here, because I'm going to be, when I post, I'm going to create something. So I'm going to return actually a 201. It's created. But what I also need to do is I need to say what it is that I want to send up there. So in Swagger 2.0, it used to be a parameter with a special type. Now there's a whole complete object called a request body. So I say my request body is going to look like this. And what else am I going to say about the request? Well, it's required. And it has a particular schema. No, it has content. It's some application/JSON. But I want to tell it what that JSON is going to look like, so I'm going to, I could actually type schema, give it a little bit of schema. Now, this schema language is similar to JSON schema, but we like to call it a subset, superset of JSON schema. Sorry, there's a question. Yep. Yes, it's particularly annoying, and it's quite common. Yeah, unfortunately it was a holdover from 2.0. It was a required field in 2.0, and the decision was made not to make it optional. I mean, you can do things like returns representation of a topic, right? But that your documentation becomes really redundant. But I mean, the way it worked in 2.0 is even you would have a description here in the topic. I've got to spell description correctly. That would say returns a topic. But then here you'd then go in and write a description in post that says creates a topic, and you end up with extremely boilerplate documentation. One of the things that did actually get added in 3.0 is you can go up and put documentation right up at the path level, and this is a topic to be covered at the conference. So there are a variety of ways that you can add documentation into here. There's two perspectives here. One is it doesn't change your interface. So from a contract-based perspective, it doesn't really change the way clients are generated and the way servers might behave. But obviously from a generation of documentation, it makes a difference. One of the problems that we've found with tooling at the moment is putting documentation up at this root level. Most of the tooling doesn't support it yet at the path item level, I should say the root. Because most documentation, if we actually run this now, actually just let me add one more thing here and I'll show you what it does with the documentation. No, I'm looking in the wrong place. Back up. No. Here we go. We were adding a schema, and I'm just going to make this type object and have some properties, propertos, name, type. JSON schema is kind of verbose, but once you get used to it, it's not terrible for validation purposes. Okay, so that is there. Let's just run this, and we'll go back to that conversation about description, because I think it's important. Let's see how many mistakes I made. Okay, so we got a little bit of a here, and we dig into topics, and now we have this thing that says get return to topic. But you see how each operation is kind of placed as peers. It's just a big long list of operations. There's been much debate about whether or not these should be described and grouped at the path level, because a lot of people want to build things resource-oriented, therefore we should be describing the resource. We don't need to re-describe what it means to do a get or a delete or a post. And you can do that with tags. You can attach tags to the, I'm not going to do it now because it would take me too long to type, but you can attach tags to the operations, and then the docs will then group it up at a path level. But most of the tooling still doesn't support displaying these descriptions that are displayed up at the top level, because what you can do is if you use a tag to group all of the operations related to a resource, you can put a description against the tag, and that's what it displays. So there's flaws galore in all of the description languages, and we're working with the best of the worst, or the whatever, however you phrase that. Yes. Try not to be completely redundant in your documentation. Pick where you think it should go in the most clear way and add it there. And if you don't want to write OK and create it against them, fine, just put quotes. Not going to cause a problem. Yes. So, oh yeah, that was the other thing that I wanted to show, that we created that post. Now I can't remember the key combination to bring that back up. There we go. Scroll down to that post, and we drill down here, and we now see that we have an application JSON response with the 201 created. Apparently, I made a syntax error because it's not showing. It should show me the parameters that I created in the example in the schema. Let's see if we can see where the mistake is. Sorry? That's a property in the JSON schema. So I can call this topic name. It could be anything here. This is just my user-defined thing. Okay, let's throw it into Swagger editor and see if we can. There's an awful lot of red here. I'd expect it to go green somewhere here. Schema error, should be object. Not complaining. Maybe this one will render it properly. Request body. Oh, it's got the example here. Okay, it looks like it was just that the plugin isn't. And I have a model here. I can flip over to here, and I can see that that's the property, and what I really should also do is make it required. Okay, so you can start to see how the description that we've put in the YAML file is reflected into hopefully fairly usable documentation, and there's actually even a try it out button here so the user can press the button and actually execute the request against an API if it existed. So I was going to just add in here and say that that topic name is required. Okay, so now that would actually be reflected in the description also. Okay. So we have the ability to now create topics. Now let's talk about being able to drill down a little bit into detail into one of these things. So we want to be able to get at a particular topic. And you'll see that in the URI, we have the little curly braces with an ID, which is a path parameter. So we actually have to describe that parameter in our OpenAPI description. So we have a new element called parameters. Now this is actually, it's not a map, it's a list. So we use the little hyphen in YAML to say that this is a list. We put the name, we're going to call it just ID. We're going to say that it's required. Now the reason it's a list is because lists are ordered, whereas maps do not have any implicit order. And if you're code genning clients and creating signatures of methods, all of a sudden the order of parameters becomes significant, and if you flip them around, you could break client code if you regenerate a new client. So it's a list. It's a little inconvenient, but it's the only way of capturing those semantics. And the same goes, just as we described schemas for the payload that we were posting, we can also describe a schema for the actual parameter and say this is type number. Okay, so now we have a parameter here to be able to retrieve a particular topic. Let's go just create a response. Okay, so let's put our redundant description in here. Now, I said before this needs to be a string. The reason it needs to be a string is we now support this kind of wildcarding. So you can say, look, like if you get a 401, 402, 411, it doesn't matter, like this is what the response is going to look like. And for example, you could say here, content. Let's put description. Content application slash. Finally, we have a media type registered for describing and providing more details on a particular error. Don't go out and create your own format for exactly what that additional payload looks like. There is actually one registered now, and there's tooling available to parse it and get all the details out. So we can start writing generic tooling that will help us, instead of every API creating their own unique snowflake format for this. And we can also reuse it for this one too. Jeez, that's my bad. Okay. So this is sort of the description of what might happen with regard to when you're making a request to retrieve a topic. Now, let's say you've got this topic, but wouldn't it be nice to know the sessions that are related to that particular topic? We described that as a little link in here. Now, how can we do that over here and describe that relationship in our document? Well, there is a new property called links. So we can say that if you get a valid 200 OK response back from a topic, you can now reference another operation here. So we're going to call this topic sessions, because we just have to give that link some kind of name. And then it has two properties to this. It has operation ID and parameters. Okay, so we are actually, I'm going to leave these blank just for a second. We're actually going to link down to this operation further down here, which is getting a list of sessions. Now, currently, this, as it's defined, would return all of the sessions, right? But we're going to add a parameter in here so that we can only return sessions related to a particular topic, and we'll use an optional query parameter. So we do parameters, and we say, this is a list. We'll give it a name. We'll call it topic ID. And we are going to, what else are we going to say? Required. Required equals false, not equals. Required colon false. And we are going to say it is in the query. Actually, I think I forgot something when I was back up here. When I was doing parameters, I was supposed to say this is in the path. That's what I forgot. So this is now in the query. And we're going to give it a schema. We're going to say the type is a number. Some integer ID, whatever. So we know what parameter to pass in here if we want to get a filtered list of sessions, and we want to be able to reference it from that other resource. So we don't need to, but ideally we're going to give it an operation ID, which is just a unique identifier to identify this particular operation. We're going to call it get sessions, and then we're going to reference that from this link over here. And in parameters, we're going to say we need to supply a topic ID when we're calling that related operation. And, well, where are we going to get that from? Well, if we look at this particular operation that we're using as the context of the link, it actually has that topic ID as one of its own parameters. So there's a special syntax in 3.0 that allows you to say, not required at all, to say request.path.id, and it will correlate that incoming parameter with something that can be used to feed that outbound parameter. So now, not only am I able to describe just a list of operations, but I can also do relationships between those resources, which allows me to start to describe paths and workflows through my API. So when I'm generating documentation, somebody now can start to explore, okay, well, how do I get to here and how do I get to there? And often when you look at documentation, you'll see this documentation that says, okay, you need to call this and you need to have this parameter and this parameter and this parameter. I'm like, well, where am I going to get that from? Well, if you have the ability to follow links in order to acquire the necessary information you need to call that next thing, these links are able to describe that flow. So that kind of gives you an idea of how you would map that diagram I drew with the resources and relationships into a textual document. Let me go back to slides. Stop. Yay. Before I go on, is there any questions? Yes. It should show, when you generate use Swagger UI to generate the description, it should actually show in the dropdown. That is the particular content type. And if you support multiple different content types, they will appear in the Swagger UI documentation. That's a good question. Does it default? It probably picks the first one on the UI. Again, it's tooling dependent. The spec doesn't have a way of saying this is the default content type that is returned, which it really should. You can select, when you make a call, you can, with an accept header, specifically say which content type that you want to return. And because you could dynamically access that description, you can find out which ones are supported. But yeah, there should be a way of saying this is the default one that's going to be returned, or it's going to return a 406 if you don't actually ask me for a specific header. So we've seen some of the details of how you actually construct the actual contract. Let's step back and take a little bit of a bigger look at OpenAPI, because there's a bunch of other parts of an OpenAPI contract that we didn't cover. We really focused mainly on the path side of things. And I throw around the term API, right? But what does API mean in an HTTP world? What is the scope of an API? Because really, it's just a set of resources that are completely independent that could just be arbitrarily grouped together. One of the things that works well with OpenAPI is if you follow this path of using a common base path in order to group operations together to be part of one API. So let's say this API existed at HBS example.org/conference/sessions. Then the conference could be a base path to all of the resources in this particular API description, in this particular document. Now, obviously, over time, your API is going to grow, and it's like, well, maybe we need to split this out into multiple documents. And you could then say, well, the base path is conference/sessions. So all the sessions-related things are in one particular API, and all of topics type stuff are in another and the reviews are in another. It's really up to you how you define it, but having this idea of using a common base path to group them together is kind of useful. Maybe it maps to a unit of deployment. Maybe it maps to a unit of versioning. These are things that you need to think about and decide. And when it comes to the rest of the document in an OpenAPI contract, we talked about info, which is the title and the version, but there's other things that you can put in there. You can put license information there. You can put terms of usage information in there. We have the servers node, which replaces the old host, base path, and schemes. You can specify multiple servers in there. You can parameterize those servers. So you might want to have multiple servers defined, maybe for geographical distribution. Maybe you want to have a production versus a sandbox URL. The important thing is that all of those servers point to the same version of the API, the same behavior, and the same contract. We have a security section that allows you to define whether it uses an API key, whether it uses OAuth. You can mix and match them, and you can change them on a per resource level. You can have multiple different security requirements that are needed. We support OpenID Connect now also within there. We talked a little bit about tags as just a tool to organize. You can connect documentation and descriptions to tags, and you can use it for presentation and layout, and also potentially for behavior when generating client code. Also we have external docs, because again, we can generate documentation from here, but it's purely reference documentation. It isn't the whole story of documentation. It doesn't do getting started. It doesn't do how-tos. It doesn't do tutorials. You can't use the generation of the docs as the excuse to go, yep, I'm done my documentation. No, this is only one part of that documentation. Admittedly, it's the annoying, irritating, manually labor-intensive part, so it's good that we can automate that, but it isn't the complete story. And finally, we have components, because when you're defining an API, it's highly likely that you are going to reuse concepts. You're going to reuse parameters, reuse content types throughout your API design, and you can put reusable components into a special section and then just reference them from where they are used within the OpenAPI description. And one more thing before I move to the next slide is there is a convention that in a large number of the objects within the spec, you can add your own custom metadata just by prefixing it with an X dash. You say X dash my stuff, and you can put whatever you want. So that's, it's a handy tool for both just doing your own completely custom stuff. It's a handy tool for us to prototype new behavior, and when there's a certain amount of community momentum around a particular behavior, then it's a candidate for, okay, let's formalize this and move this into the official spec, and let's start to get some more support around this in tooling. So I mentioned we have components, so you can reuse components within a particular document, but also at some point the document's going to get too large. As an example, we actually did a project at Microsoft recently where the Graph API, the Microsoft Graph that surfaces all the Office 365, Microsoft 365 data, is actually all described in a language called CSDL, which is the OData, Conceptual Schema Description Language. And people want to be able to have OpenAPI to describe that API because they want to be able to use certain tooling that supports OpenAPI. So we've written a translator that will convert, and we converted the entire graph. It was 1 million lines of JSON. It was a 30 meg file. It's not a particularly usable artifact, so we'll be splitting that out into smaller pieces. And there's various ways that you can do reuse of external files. You can take an OpenAPI document and reference into another complete OpenAPI document and point to its components. So you can create OpenAPI documents that are basically just reusable libraries of just mainly components and leave most of the other elements empty. But it's good because the tooling will still validate it properly and everything's all happy and you can continue using that with your regular tooling. The other way that you can do references is you can reference what we call fragments. So that would be, commonly it's done with JSON schema. So you point to an external file that is either JSON or YAML in an OpenAPI format, but it isn't a complete document. And then during the processing of that file, we will include that and take the context of where the reference is to apply the semantics and syntax to the particular fragment. That's handy for folks who want to do JSON schema descriptions that they want to parse and validate using standard JSON schema tooling. It's not ideal because our native schema in OpenAPI isn't exactly the same. It does some things that JSON schema doesn't, and it doesn't do all the things that JSON schema does, so it's a bit of a challenge. There is a proposal that's going on at the moment to implement a new thing called alternate schema. So you're going to be able to point to an external file that is any kind of schema. If you want to use XSDs, you want to use RelaxNG or Schematron or protobuf schema, you'll be able to point to an external file that uses any kind of schema, and you'd be able to point to real JSON schema at that point. It's been a big request from many people. And the final type of reusable concept is, I call it an artifact. It is something that isn't compliant to the OpenAPI spec at all. It might be some example of some payload, some XML chunk, or it may be an image. If you've got an API that returns images, you maybe want to have an example for helping with testing or documentation, maybe a PDF file, who knows, it could be anything. There's various places where we can point to any arbitrary artifact. And again, we have syntax to be able to point to those external files. Yes, of course. The reuse, the challenges that I've seen in reuse generally come around payloads. When you end up with creating, updating, and put versus patch, and you end up with this, here's a set of properties, and well, when we're creating it, these ones are required. But when you're updating it, you're not allowed to change these properties. And when you are doing a patch, you can patch anything, and you can include any number of properties. So there is this, well, I want to reuse all the property definitions, but in varying different ways. And I've seen a variety of different approaches to do it, and they're all fairly ugly in JSON schema. I've seen some slightly nicer ways of doing it, but I think there's some challenges when it comes to code gen. We're still evolving and finding the right solution. One solution I really like is you basically start with a vocabulary. So you define a set of terms as reusable terms, and then when it comes to a particular operation, you just opt in to the pieces of vocabulary that belong to that particular operation. So for this operation, we use this property, this property, this property. So the reuse is down at the finest grain. Because one of the things that I've seen that becomes a real mess is when you start saying, well, this set of properties are common to create an update, but they're not common to patch. So I'm going to pull it in from here and here, and it gets, I can actually show you an example. But that's payload modeling is by far the hardest thing to do. And one of the reasons is because JSON schema was never designed to do modeling. JSON schema was designed to do validation. So we are misusing it. And the JSON schema folks know that, and they're working on trying to enhance the vocabulary. JSON schema kind of went into a dark ages period for a couple of years. The people worked on early versions of JSON schema, and then they got busy doing other stuff, and then nothing happened from like draft 3 for a couple of years. And all over the last year or so, there's been a few new people who picked up the project and started working on a lot more stuff. So there is promise to improve the situation there, and hopefully having the ability to do alternate schema will open the doors to maybe either use better versions of Jada, newer, better versions of JSON schema, or some other language that is actually designed to do modeling. From a reuse point of view on parameters, security stuff, other areas, I haven't seen any major challenges. There is one factor that we hoped to get into 3.0, but it didn't make it, which is being able to reuse a group of things. So a group of parameters, a group of headers, that's currently not supported. We're hoping to be able to get something into a future spec where you can say, I just like to use this set of parameters in this particular operation. Does that vaguely kind of dance around your question? Yeah, you can make a mess. You can do things really nicely. There isn't a prescriptive answer to this is the best way of doing reuse. What I do recommend, though, and I sort of alluded to it while I was going through the example, is that do the design from a top down. Like, do the high level. These are the resources, because you can get into a lot of detail. You can get into the media types and the examples and schemas, and if you're doing form posts, you can do encoding of form posts, and you can do complex parameters and all kinds of stuff. But don't add stuff into this contract unless it is really adding value to the system, unless you can actually use that. Just don't add in, well, because this is a fact, so therefore I'm going to add it in. Remember, this is a contract that people are going to take a dependency on the things that you tell them, and removing something out of it could potentially be a breaking change. So add stuff where it makes sense. Don't just arbitrarily tell people absolutely everything. We still have to do other documentation. We still have to do how-tos and tutorials. So it doesn't necessarily need to contain absolutely everything in the contract description. But what you end up with is this document that becomes the single source of truth. It is a textual document that can be source controlled, so we can do change management. It is something that can drive client libraries across a whole bunch of different languages. On the server side, we can use it for doing mocking. There are tools that will generate mock servers, so client developers don't have to wait for a server implementation to complete. There are tools that allow you to use that metadata at runtime for routing. So, I mean, you know, if you're familiar with ASP.NET and you start having to add all the different attributes for the parameters, for model binding, for validating of parameters, for validating of payloads, this document actually contains all that metadata for how a model binder might actually do all that validation of incoming data and actually have all the description for what the output looks like. I keep harassing the ASP.NET team to say, look, we need to add support for being able to just drive our UI, our APIs directly off this metadata and not have to create routing attributes and all the other attributes. And they're like, yeah, but people like to do, you know, code first, API first, and they like to auto-generate. Like, yeah, there is a set of people that do that, but there's also a set of people who would really rather do it this way, contract first, and I think we should support both sides of that. And we talked documentation is obviously one of the leading factors that lead people down this path of generating or creating API descriptions. And as your company starts to, we see this more and more, as companies start to realize the value of creating and formalizing their API process within a company, they start to create API guidelines. They start to have things like people reviewing APIs to make sure they're conforming with guidelines. And API descriptions are the perfect place because to review a description of the API, or to review changes of an API in order to say, yes, this API conforms to our company standards so that we're doing things consistently across the API. Which brings me to change. As I say, we can source control it, we can view the changes, but you have to look at change in a funny way. We have in the industry this reliance on the term, oh, it's a breaking change. And I'm sure I can ask 25 people what it means to be a breaking change, and I will get 25 different answers. Because context is everything, and ironically, it is not the API provider that defines what is and isn't a breaking change. It's how the client consumes that API. that determines whether or not something is a breaking change. I mean, everybody assumes that, you can change two properties around from one, what order, it doesn't really matter, right? That's not a breaking change. But we have data contract serializer that used to be dependent on it. So it was dependent on the order of the properties that appeared in the actual response. So you can write a client that is highly coupled to all kinds of different changes. What we've found, that I've been working in API management on kind of this change management, and we coined the terms revisions and versions as a way of avoiding talking about breaking changes. So the difference between a revision and a version is, a revision is where I'm going to change the API in a way where I'm just going to make the change and I'm going to push it out to you at my will, and you need to be prepared and adapt to that. As a consumer of my API, you need to adapt to, if I add a new property to the payload or add a new operation, you shouldn't break. And that's what I call a revision. Whereas my deal is a version, I will let you know, and I will create a new resource identifier, and I will allow you to opt in to that change. So if I remove an operation or I rename some resource, I will use a version identifier in order for you to be able to opt in. So by using that terminology, it helps to remove that ambiguity as to what exactly is a breaking change. But it requires you as an API provider to document what you consider revision type changes and what version type changes, and communicate with that with the consumers of your API so they can plan to build clients that aren't going to break when you introduce new revisions. So it's one thing to, maybe I've convinced you that this is something that's worth looking into as an alternative way of doing it, but it's another thing altogether to go back to the office and say, hey, we should try this contract first API design. So I attempted to kind of consolidate this down into a single pitch, in that OpenAPI has become the de facto standard for describing efficiently HTTP interfaces in a platform-independent way that can drive both client and server tooling. And it provides a common language for developers, product managers, users, customers to communicate about that interface. There is an active developer community who are working on tooling, working to enhance the specification, and it has wide industry support from both the large enterprises and down to small Silicon Valley stuff. But seriously, who does it? Is there people doing it? Well, there are. I'm out of time, but if you go to this URL, you will find all of the contracts, the OpenAPI contracts for the Azure Management APIs. All the services, we all expose them via contracts. We are expected to update those contracts and issue pull requests to those contracts to be reviewed by a review board before we go off and do the actual implementation. So all the versions of the APIs are all documented there for all of the Azure services. If you want to find more information out, we have the OpenAPI specification is on the GitHub repo. We have comments about participating. We keep it visible when we have the meetings. You can join, you can issue pull requests, you can complain what doesn't work, what you'd like to have fixed. You can create changes and get approval for them, and we can maybe get some new stuff in there to make it even better. For as far as guidelines are concerned, when you're building APIs, Microsoft has the Microsoft API guidelines that are out there on GitHub, and we encourage people to comment and provide feedback just to use as a suggestion if you want to build your own guidelines. I wouldn't copy them directly, but they can be certainly used as inspiration. And if you're looking for tooling that supports OpenAPI V3, we have a list of implementations, and if you write something, you can create a pull request for us, and we'll accept the pull request and add it to the list of implementations. And if you happen to be in the .NET space, Microsoft, recently we worked on an interdivisional project to produce a single library that does parsing of OpenAPI V3 and V2, and it will upgrade and downgrade. And we've got a bunch of different writers and readers for that project. That came out of preview just 2 days ago. So feel free to take a look at that. And I'm always on Twitter. If you ever have questions, feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for joining me for this hour.